If you're just catching up, here's where things stood. I had just spent the most honest night of my life with a woman named Aurora, a woman I met by pure chance after being stood up at a pub, a night that ended with our first kiss caught on camera in the middle of a crowded dance floor. We woke up tangled together the next morning, only to discover that the photographs had already gone viral overnight, along with a string of furious, controlling messages from my ex-husband. Here is what happened next. The days that followed were harder than anything I had prepared myself for. My phone would not stop buzzing, colleagues sending careful, probing messages disguised as concern, reporters who covered the court suddenly very interested in the private details of my personal life. I told myself I was equipped to handle scrutiny, that I had spent my entire career being watched and judged by people who thought they understood me. This felt entirely different. This wasn't about a ruling I had made from the bench. This was about my heart, laid bare for the whole internet to pick apart at its leisure. As a federal judge, my face landed everywhere within hours, splashed across gossip columns and legal circles alike, and the reaction from my conservative professional world was not punitive so much as it was shocked, whispered about in hallways I used to walk through with absolute confidence. I could feel the sideways glances even when no one said a single word to my face. 45 years of careful reputation, undone in a single viral night. And I was not entirely sure yet how to stand back up inside it. Aurora was struggling too, though in a quieter way that she tried hard not to show me. Her company had built its reputation on a certain polished image, and suddenly her name was trending for reasons that had nothing to do with her products at all. She told me, in a message that arrived late one night, that she was terrified the attention would hurt everything she had worked so hard to build, that maybe we had moved too fast, too publicly, too soon for either of us to have prepared properly. Neither of us said it outright, but somewhere in that exhausting first week, we simply stopped reaching for each other the way we had that first magical night. My calls to her grew shorter. Her replies grew slower, more careful, more guarded. I told myself it was practical, a temporary retreat until the noise finally died down. But underneath that practical excuse sat something rawer and more frightening, a fear that I had upended my entire careful life for a feeling that might not survive real contact with the outside world. My ex-husband's messages did not stop either. He called twice, his voice tight with a jealousy that had no claim on me anymore, insisting he only wanted to help me protect my reputation, insisting I owed him some kind of explanation for what I did with my own life. I did not answer either call. Some old tired part of me still flinched at his tone out of habit, the same habit that had kept me quiet and agreeable through 18 years of marriage. But a newer, harder part of me simply let the phone ring out into silence. I threw myself back into work, back onto the bench, back into the version of myself the world had always expected me to be. But even in the middle of a hearing, some small, traitorous part of my mind would drift back to the warmth of her hands at my waist, the sound of her laugh over gin and stolen glances, the particular unhurried way she had said my name against my ear on that crowded dance floor. I told myself the silence between us was for the best. That space would protect us both. I did not believe it, not even for a single quiet moment. The apartment I had once found merely lonely now felt almost unbearable in its emptiness. I would walk past the side of the bed that used to be Marcus's, the same side that had sat empty for 5 long months, and find myself instead thinking of sheets that had smelled briefly of someone else's perfume, of a warmth I had only just discovered and already felt slipping away. I had spent years mourning the slow death of a marriage. I had no idea a few short weeks without Aurora could ache this sharply. This specifically, in a place I hadn't even known was capable of feeling this much. I did not know yet, sitting alone in that too-quiet apartment night after night, that the internet had already begun writing a very different story about the two of us than the one my fear kept insisting was true. I only knew that I missed her in a way that frightened me, and that every single day of silence between us felt like its own small, quiet betrayal of the one honest thing I had allowed myself in years. It was Aurora, strangely enough, who first noticed the shift, and she told me about it days later in a message I read at least a dozen times before I let myself believe it. What had begun as invasive, uncomfortable gossip had slowly, almost overnight, turned into something else entirely, something warmer and far less expected. People who had never met either of us began sharing that photograph from the dance floor again, not to shame us this time, but almost reverently, calling it one of the most beautiful things they had seen online in months. I found myself, against my better judgment, searching our names late one night, curled up alone on my couch with the lights off and the television murmuring uselessly in the background. What I found stopped me cold in the best possible way. Strangers by the hundreds, then the thousands, had started calling us the couple of the moment, marveling at the contrast between us, her fire-colored hair against my deep brown skin, her easy freedom against my careful composure, framing it all as something rare and worth rooting for rather than something shameful to be hidden away. There were comments from women my age, thanking me for existing so visibly, telling me that watching a 45-year-old federal judge fall unexpectedly in love had given them permission to imagine new things for their own lives. There were comments from Aurora's own customers, declaring louder support for her brand specifically because of the courage she'd shown, not despite it. I sat there scrolling long past midnight, feeling something loosen slowly in my chest that had been tight and guarded for 2 long, silent weeks. I thought about calling her right then, in the middle of the night, just to tell her what I'd found, just to hear her voice again after days of careful, deliberate distance. My thumb hovered over her name for a long moment before I set the phone down instead, some old, cautious habit still holding me back, even as everything in me wanted to reach for her. I told myself it was too late to call, that I should wait until morning, until I had gathered my thoughts properly. The truth was simpler and far less dignified. I was still afraid, even with the whole internet apparently rooting for us, that reaching for her again might somehow prove too much, too fast, too real. The following days brought more of the same unexpected warmth. Articles calling our story a quiet act of bravery, strangers online debating fondly over which of us seemed more smitten in the photograph, entire threads dedicated to wishing us well without ever having spoken to either of us directly. It was surreal, watching total strangers construct a hopeful narrative around something I had barely allowed myself to believe was real. Watching them root so openly for a version of happiness I had been too frightened to claim out loud myself. I noticed something else too, something quieter and more personal beneath all that public noise. My own colleagues, the ones who had first responded with careful, sideways concern, slowly began softening as well, a few of them even reaching out with genuine warmth once they saw how the wider world had responded. It seemed the harshest judgment I had feared was never going to come from the internet at all. It had only ever been coming from inside my own frightened, careful head. I began to notice, too, how much of my exhaustion over those 2 silent weeks had come not from public scrutiny at all, but from the private ache of missing her. An ache I had been trying very hard to disguise as caution, as practicality, as good sense. Every article calling us beautiful, every stranger's kind comment beneath that photograph, only made the distance between Aurora and me feel more unnecessary, more self-inflicted, more like a punishment I was choosing to endure for no good reason at all. One night, unable to sleep, I sat up in bed scrolling through yet another thread of strangers, hoping we would find our way back to each other, and finally let myself admit the truth I had been avoiding for 2 long weeks. I did not regret a single second of that first night with her. I only regretted the silence that had followed it, the careful, cowardly distance I had let grow between us out of fear instead of honesty. I decided, somewhere around 2 a.m, surrounded by the quiet, hopeful noise of strangers who didn't even know our full names, that fear had run my life long enough already. I did not know yet, closing my phone and finally letting myself drift toward sleep, that within days my ex-husband would show up in person, determined to pull me back into the careful, smaller life I had already started to outgrow. I only knew, lying there in the dark, that whatever happened next, I was done letting silence speak for me. He was waiting for me outside the courthouse 2 days later, leaning against his car with his arms crossed in that particular way he used to stand when he wanted to make a point without raising his voice. I felt my stomach tighten the moment I saw him, an old, familiar reflex from 18 years of marriage, the instinct to smooth things over before they escalated, to make myself smaller so the peace could hold a little longer. "We need to talk," he said, falling into step beside me as I tried to walk past him toward the parking garage, his voice carrying that same practiced calm he always used right before he said something designed to cut. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to your reputation? To our reputation? People we've known for 20 years are asking me questions I shouldn't have to answer." I stopped walking and turned to face him fully, something steady and unfamiliar settling into my spine that had nothing to do with the composure I wear on the bench. "There is no our reputation anymore, Marcus," I said, my voice even, quieter than I expected it to come out. "You made that decision 5 months ago when you packed your bags and left." He tried a different approach then, softer, more wounded. The tone he used to use when logic failed and guilt seemed like the better tool. He said he was only trying to protect me, that he still cared what happened to me, that surely I understood how this looked to people who mattered. I listened to him carefully, the way I listen to closing arguments I already know I am going to rule against, and felt something cold and clear settle over me where old habit used to be. "You don't get to protect me from a life you're no longer part of," I told him, and I watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the one who used to apologize first in every disagreement. "I spent 18 years making myself smaller so you could feel comfortable. I am done doing that, for you or for anyone else." He pushed harder then, his composure slipping just slightly, muttering something about how this wasn't who I was, how I had never been the kind of woman who behaved this recklessly, how surely some part of me knew this whole thing was some kind of midlife mistake I would regret. I felt the old me, the careful, agreeable version of myself, want to shrink under the weight of his disapproval the way I always had. But a newer, steadier voice inside me simply refused to let that happen this time. "The woman you knew spent 5 months sitting alone in an apartment, mourning a marriage that had been quietly dying for years before you finally admitted it," I said, my voice steady despite the sharp ache rising briefly in my chest. "That woman was tired, Marcus, and lonely, and slowly disappearing into a life that no longer fit her. I am not interested in going back to being her, not for your comfort, and not for anyone else's opinion of what a woman my age is supposed to want." He didn't have an answer for that, not really, though he tried a few more times to find one, his voice growing sharper, more frustrated, less careful with each attempt. I simply stood there and let him finish, the way I let every closing argument finish before delivering my ruling, and then I told him plainly that I did not want him contacting me again outside of whatever our lawyers required. I watched something in his face finally accept defeat, some old certainty about his hold over me crumbling for good in the parking garage light. Walking away from him that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in longer than I could measure, some old invisible weight lifting cleanly off my shoulders for the first time since he'd packed his bags. I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the intact status I had spent decades protecting, the careful reputation, the untouchable composure, the quiet, dutiful marriage, had never actually been freedom at all. It had simply been a prison built so carefully I had mistaken its walls for safety. I got into my car, sat for a long moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, and let myself think, fully and without guilt, about copper hair spread across a white pillow, about hands that had once traced my waist like something worth being gentle with. I did not know yet exactly how I was going to find my way back to her, or whether she would even let me back in after 2 weeks of careful, cowardly silence. I only knew, starting the engine and pulling out of that parking garage, that I was finally, completely done being afraid of what I wanted. I did not call ahead. I did not rehearse a single word on the drive over, though my mind tried repeatedly to hand me some careful, lawyerly speech, some composed explanation for 2 weeks of silence that I could deliver without falling apart. I ignored every version of it. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I simply let myself act, instead of calculate. Her building looked exactly the way I remembered it. Warm light glowing behind a few scattered windows. The same steps I had walked up once before, feeling like a lifetime had passed since that first night. I stood in front of her door for a long moment before I finally knocked, my heart hammering so hard I was certain she would hear it through the wood before she ever opened the door. When it finally swung open, she stood there in an old sweater, hair loose around her shoulders, and the surprise on her face slowly gave way to something far more vulnerable. "Naomi," she said quietly, my name sounding different in her mouth than I remembered. Careful, almost afraid to hope. Neither of us moved for a moment, both of us simply looking at each other across the threshold like two people who had spent 2 long weeks convincing themselves this reunion wasn't allowed to happen. I felt something break open inside my chest before I had even decided to speak. Some careful, disciplined wall I had spent 45 years constructing, finally giving way completely. "I am so tired of pretending I'm fine without you," I said, my voice cracking on the last word in a way it never cracks in a courtroom, in a way I hadn't allowed it to crack in longer than I could remember. "I have sat across from murderers without flinching, Aurora, and 2 weeks without you nearly brought me to my knees." She made a small wounded sound and reached for me before I had even finished speaking, pulling me inside and into her arms in one motion, and I let myself go completely. 45 years of careful composure dissolving against her shoulder. I told her everything then, all of it spilling out in a rush I couldn't have controlled even if I'd wanted to. The empty apartment, the ex-husband's messages, the parking garage confrontation, the nights I lay awake aching for a version of myself I had only just discovered existed. "I thought I was protecting us both by staying away," I admitted, my voice muffled against her shoulder, her arms tightening around me like she had no intention of letting go anytime soon. "I told myself it was practical. It was cowardice, Aurora. I was scared, and I let that fear cost us 2 weeks I can't get back." She pulled back just enough to look at me, her green eyes bright and unmistakably wet, and told me, with a small trembling laugh, that she had spent those exact same 2 weeks doing precisely the same thing, hiding behind careful excuses about her business, about timing, about not wanting to pressure me into something I might regret. "I missed you every single day," she said softly, her thumb brushing gently across my cheek, where a single tear had escaped without my permission. I was just too scared to say it first. Hearing her say it, hearing that the ache I had been carrying alone for 2 silent weeks had a mirror sitting in her chest as well, undid something in me completely. I felt 45 years of careful discipline finally, fully surrendered to something simpler and far more honest than any ruling I had ever handed down from the bench. There was no calculation left in me at all, no careful weighing of consequences, only the overwhelming, uncomplicated relief of being exactly where I was supposed to be. "I don't want to hide anymore," I told her, my hands coming up to rest against her face, the way hers had rested against mine that first night on the dance floor. Not from the internet, not from my ex-husband, not from my own fear of what people will say about a 45-year-old judge falling for a woman with fire in her hair. I just want you, Aurora. I want to stop being careful and start being honest with you for as long as you'll let me. She didn't answer with words. She simply pulled me back into her arms, holding on tightly enough that I could feel her heartbeat racing against mine. Both of us finally, fully done pretending that 2 weeks of silence had ever once made either of us feel anything close to whole. I had no idea, standing there wrapped in her arms in the soft light of her hallway, just how completely that single honest confession was about to change the rest of my life, starting that very same night. She led me by the hand from the hallway, into the warm, familiar quiet of her apartment. Neither of us saying much. Both of us aware that 2 weeks of careful distance had already said everything that needed saying out loud. The space between us felt different this time, lighter somehow, cleared of the fear and hesitation that had haunted that very first night together. There was only relief now, and something steadier underneath it. Something that felt less like discovery and more like coming home. What happened between us that night, I will keep close the way I kept the first night close, except to say that it felt entirely different this time around. There was no trembling uncertainty in it, no quiet fear standing guard at the edges of either of us. There was only the two of us finally choosing each other on purpose instead of by accident, deliberate and unhurried and completely unafraid, 2 weeks of aching distance dissolving into something that felt, for the first time, permanent. I remember the particular gentleness of her hands against my skin, familiar now in a way that undid me more than the first night's newness ever had. Her voice low and warm, murmuring my name like it was something precious she had been afraid to lose. I remember the racing of my own heart slowing gradually into something steadier, something that felt less like falling and more like finally landing exactly where I belonged. Whatever fear either of us had carried into that room dissolved slowly into something far simpler, far more certain. Long before the night was through, afterward, we lay tangled together in the soft dark of her bedroom, her fingers tracing slow, absent patterns against my arm. Both of us quiet, in the particular way people are quiet, after finally saying everything that needed to be said. I felt her breath even out against my shoulder, felt the warmth of her skin pressed close to mine, and understood with sudden, total clarity that I did not want to spend one more single day pretending this feeling was something to be managed or hidden away. "I'm tired of hiding," I said quietly into the dark, my fingers finding hers where they rested against my arm. I spent 5 months hiding my loneliness because I thought a woman my age wasn't supposed to admit she needed anything. I spent 2 weeks hiding you because I was afraid of what people would say. I don't want to live carefully anymore, Aurora. I want to live honestly, even if it costs me something. She went still beside me for a moment, and then propped herself up on one elbow to look at me properly in the dim light coming through her curtains, something searching and hopeful in her expression. "Do you mean that?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard from her before. Not even in our very first conversation at the pub. "Because I've been ready to stop hiding since the night that photographer caught us on the dance floor. I just didn't want to push you somewhere you weren't ready to go." "I mean it completely," I told her, reaching up to brush a strand of copper hair away from her face, feeling something settle firmly into place inside my chest, something that felt a great deal like certainty. "I want the whole world to know exactly who I fell for. I am done being ashamed of the best thing that has happened to me in years, maybe in my entire life." She smiled then, slow and radiant, the same smile that had first caught my attention across a crowded pub weeks earlier, except now it carried none of the careful distance of strangers, only the open warmth of someone who had decided, finally and fully, to stop being afraid alongside me. "Then let's stop hiding," she said simply, pressing her forehead gently against mine in the dark. Together, out loud, whatever it costs us, we stayed awake talking well past midnight, working out together what coming forward would actually look like, what it might cost each of us professionally, what support we would need to lean on from each other in the weeks ahead. There was no more fear in the planning, only a steady, shared resolve. 2 women who had each spent their own lives being careful for other people's comfort, finally choosing to be brave for their own sake instead. I fell asleep sometime near dawn, with her arm draped over my waist, feeling, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. We didn't plan some elaborate announcement, the kind of carefully staged reveal I might have scripted in my old cautious life. Aurora simply posted a photograph of the 2 of us a few days later. Nothing dramatic, just her arm around my shoulders, and both of us laughing at something out of frame, with a caption that said only that she was grateful, and that she hoped people would be as happy for us as we had finally become for ourselves. I braced myself that morning the way I brace myself before delivering a difficult verdict, steadying my breath, preparing careful answers for questions I assumed would arrive sharp and hostile. I had spent weeks fearing exactly this moment, rehearsing composure for a public I was certain would judge me harshly for choosing happiness so visibly, so late in life, so far outside anything I had ever let myself want before. What I received instead was something I hadn't let myself hope for. The response was overwhelming and almost entirely warm. People who had followed our story for weeks flooded the comments beneath that photograph with genuine joy, calling us beautiful together, thanking us both for being brave enough to be honest in public after everything we'd already been through. Colleagues I had quietly worried would judge me instead sent careful, kind messages of support, several admitting they had been rooting for me since the story first broke. Even strangers who had no real connection to either of us reached out simply to say that watching two women our age find each other so unexpectedly had given them hope for their own lives, their own overlooked chances at happiness. I sat at my kitchen table that morning reading message after message, feeling something unclench slowly in my chest that had been tight for years, long before I ever met Aurora. A fear of being fully seen that I hadn't even realized I was carrying until it finally, completely let go. Aurora called me that evening, breathless with something between disbelief and pure joy, telling me her phone had not stopped ringing all day with new followers, new customers, messages from women all over the world, saying our story had moved them in ways they hadn't expected. I sat on my couch listening to her laugh, feeling proud of her in a way that surprised me with its intensity, prouder of her success in that moment than I had ever felt about any ruling I had handed down in my entire career. "I never thought this would be the reaction," she admitted, her voice still slightly unsteady with wonder. "I braced myself for the worst. I thought I might lose customers, lose respect, lose everything I'd built. Instead, people are saying they trust the brand more because of who I am, not less." I told her I understood that feeling completely, that I had spent weeks assuming the world would punish me for wanting something honest, only to discover that most people, it turned out, were simply waiting for permission to be kind. We talked long into the evening about how strange it felt, after so much fear, to be met instead with so much unexpected grace, both of us slowly allowing ourselves to trust that this happiness might actually be allowed to last. That night, I looked back at the original photograph from the dance floor, the one that had started all of this chaos months earlier, and instead of the old dread I used to feel looking at it, I felt only gratitude. What I had feared would ruin my careful, ordered life had instead cracked it open into something far more honest and far more alive than anything I had built in 45 years of careful discipline. I fell asleep that night, for the first time in longer than I could remember, without a single knot of worry sitting in my chest, only a quiet, steady happiness I still wasn't entirely used to feeling. I had absolutely no idea, drifting off to sleep that night, just how much bigger both of our lives were about to become in the months that followed, or how completely I was about to choose a different kind of life for myself entirely. In the weeks that followed, Aurora's company experienced a kind of growth she had never anticipated, not even in her most ambitious projections. Orders poured in faster than her small team could fill them. New customers writing in daily to say they wanted to support a business owned by a woman brave enough to love so openly and so publicly. She would call me late at night, giddy and disbelieving, reading me sales figures like poetry. And I found myself prouder of her success than I had ever been of any accomplishment of my own. My own world, meanwhile, was shifting in a very different direction. Every single day I sat on the bench, I felt the growing weight of a life divided sharply in two, the careful, guarded judge everyone still expected me to be, and the woman I was actually becoming, unafraid and increasingly unwilling to keep those two halves so rigidly separate. Colleagues who had once seemed like genuine friends grew subtly more distant in small, quiet ways, their questions about my personal life laced with a caution that felt less like curiosity and more like polite disapproval dressed up as concern. I began to notice, with growing clarity, how much energy I spent every single day translating myself into a version the courtroom would find acceptable, how exhausted that constant careful translation left me by the end of each long week. Meanwhile, whenever I was with Aurora, surrounded by her small, devoted team, watching her build something real out of nothing but her own 2 hands and her own fearless vision. I felt none of that exhaustion at all. I felt only the quiet, steady thrill of being entirely, completely myself. One evening, sitting in the cluttered back office of her rapidly growing company while she reviewed new packaging samples spread across her desk, I realized I had spent the entire afternoon happier than I had felt on the bench in years, possibly ever. I watched her lean over a sample bottle, biting her lip in fierce concentration, utterly consumed by something she had built out of nothing but her own passion and persistence. And I felt a longing rise in me I hadn't fully expected. Not for her specific work, but for that same unguarded freedom to build a life without constant apology. I didn't say anything about it that particular night, but the thought took root quietly and refused to let go over the following weeks. For the first time since I was a very young woman first deciding on a career, I let myself seriously imagine an entirely different kind of life, one where I got to choose, every single day, exactly which version of myself I wanted to show the world. I thought about the 18 years I had spent shrinking myself for Marcus, and the 20 years before that spent proving myself worthy of a robe and a title. And I wondered, for the first time in decades, what I might build if I finally stopped proving anything to anyone at all. I handed in my resignation from the bench on a quiet Tuesday morning, the same kind of gray morning Marcus had once moved his belongings out on. Though it felt nothing at all like that day. There was no grief in it this time, no sense of an ending. There was only a strange, clean relief, like setting down a weight I had carried for so long I had nearly forgotten it was optional in the first place. My colleagues were surprised, several of them visibly concerned, a few quietly disapproving in ways I chose very deliberately not to let bother me anymore. I explained it simply, without apology, that I had found work that let me build something alongside someone I loved, instead of managing a life split carefully and exhaustingly in 2. Most people, once they saw how genuinely at peace I had become, stopped arguing and simply wished me well, some of them with more warmth than I expected after decades of careful professional distance. Aurora cried when I told her I wanted to join her company full-time, not from doubt, but from something that looked a great deal like pure relief. She admitted she had been afraid to ask, afraid it would feel like too much pressure, afraid of wanting too much from me too soon after everything we had already survived together. I told her she hadn't asked me for anything at all. I had simply looked honestly at my own life for the first time in years, and finally chosen the parts of it that actually made me feel alive. We built something together in the months that followed, not just a thriving company, but an entire life. One that looked nothing like the careful, divided existence I had spent 45 years so meticulously constructing. I learned the rhythms of her business the way I had once learned the rhythms of the law, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I was good at it, that decades of discipline translated easily into any work done out of genuine love instead of cold obligation. I had absolutely no idea, signing that resignation letter on that quiet Tuesday morning, just how completely my life was about to bloom into something I had never once let myself imagine possible. 1 year to the week after that first bold note arrived at my table, I stood on a sun-warmed stretch of coastline, the ocean stretching gold and endless behind us. Aurora's hand steady in mine as our closest friends and family gathered quietly around us. There was no version of that lonely Thursday night, sitting alone in a pub waiting for a man who never came, that could have possibly prepared me for how completely whole I felt in that exact moment. The ceremony was small and unhurried, exactly the way both of us wanted it. Nothing performed for anyone else's benefit. Everything offered only for each other. Among the small gathering stood the same group of friends who had been at that pub table a year earlier. The ones who had first pulled Aurora toward the electronic music party that changed both our lives, now standing beside her as her closest attendants, tears already gathering in their eyes before either of us had said a single word. When I spoke my vows, my voice shook in a way it has never once shaken in any courtroom, and I did not try to steady it. I had spent so many decades of my life being composed for other people's comfort, careful and unshaken no matter what stood before me. That afternoon, standing barefoot in the sand, with the woman who had changed the entire direction of my life, I simply let myself feel everything fully, without apology, without a single moment of careful restraint. Aurora cried through most of her own vows, laughing softly at herself between the tears, telling everyone gathered there that she had sent that note across a crowded pub after her 4th gin, because some reckless, hopeful part of her had recognized something in me long before I ever recognized it in myself. She said she was grateful every single day that I had taken that first small sip of the drink she'd sent. That quiet, uncertain yes that had somehow started absolutely everything that followed. I thought, standing there with the wind gently pulling at the hem of my dress, of everything that had happened in the 12 months since that night. I thought of the viral photographs, of Marcus's furious messages, of 2 agonizing weeks spent apart out of nothing but fear. I thought of the courthouse I had walked away from, and the company we had built together instead, one that now bore both our names quietly on its letterhead. None of it had happened the way I ever would have planned it, sitting alone at that careful table for 2. All of it had led me here. Looking back now, I understand that the barrier I once believed stood so solidly between us, the fear, the scrutiny, the version of myself I thought I had to protect at any cost, was never actually as solid as it seemed at the time. It cracked the moment I finally let someone see me, honestly, fully, without the careful armor I had worn for 45 years. And on the other side of that crack waited an entire life I hadn't even known I was allowed to want for myself. I am not the same careful, guarded woman who sat alone in that pub a year ago, dressed for a man who never showed his face, quietly convinced that a life of discipline was the only life available to a woman like me. I am someone freer now, someone chosen deliberately instead of settled for, someone who finally, completely stopped translating herself for anyone else's comfort or approval. Aurora reached for my hand as the officiant pronounced us married, and I felt, for the first time in my entire 45 years, that I had arrived exactly where I was always meant to be. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you truly, from the bottom of my heart. If it moved you even half as much as it moved me to actually live it, please consider joining us over on Patreon, where we share extended moments from stories like this one that we simply can't post anywhere else. Leave a like, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, and I will see you very soon in the next story. Until then, take care of your own heart, and never be afraid of what it's quietly trying to tell you. Thank you so much for spending this whole journey with me, from that lonely table at the pub, all the way to the beach where I said my vows. Stories like this only reach more people because of you. So thank you for watching, for listening, and for believing in a love story that didn't follow any of the rules it was supposed to. See you in the next one.